Good morning and welcome to the Business Standard Morning Show. I'm Nazia Iqbal. Let's take a look at the stories for the day. 26th edition of the United Nations Conference of Parties, or COP26, started in the Scottish city of Glasgow yesterday. It would be no exaggeration to say that the fate of humanity depends on the outcome of this summit. With that in mind, we examine India's agenda going in and also delve into what New Delhi hopes to achieve in Glasgow and the challenges it will face.
The 26th UN Climate Change Conference of the Parties, better known as COP26, began in the United Kingdom yesterday. Hosted in Glasgow, the summit will conclude on 12th November. Now, before we get into the details, let's clear something up. What exactly is a COP? These conferences are organized under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, or UNFCCC, an international treaty agreed to in 1992. It came into force in 1994. COP is a summit where the 197 signatories to the UNFCCC come together to decide how to implement the treaty. At present, the signatories include 196 countries and the European Union. Now, let's talk about the latest summit. Several leaders have described COP26 as a make or break deal for the planet, and its stated goals back up such a description. COP26 will seek to finalize the Paris Rulebook, the rules needed to implement the 2015 Paris Agreement on Climate. As such, the delegates will try to find a solution regarding carbon markets, the aim being to create a robust system of carbon credits that supports the transition to net zero. Countries are also being asked to come forward with ambitious 2030 emission reduction targets that align with reaching net zero by the middle of the century. The crucial context here is that the Paris Agreement's central aim is to keep global temperature rise this century well below 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, and to pursue efforts to limit the temperature increase even further to 1.5 degrees Celsius. So, now that we know what COP26 is all about, the question that arises is, what is India's agenda at the summit?
Though India has announced an ambitious target of adding 450 gigawatt of renewable energy capacity by 2030, the country has till yet not shown any intent to phase out coal. India is going with a bag full of demands to COP26. Indian government will pressurize the developed world for the $100 billion of climate financing per year, which was committed in 2009 climate conference. If India were to meet 450 gigawatt of renewable energy target and also build a supporting infrastructure for it, it would need similar amount of funding from multilateral agencies. Indian government is also going to pitch for the reopening of the carbon credits market. Carbon credits market in the 2000s were a prominent method to invest into green energy by countries and noted investors in lieu of carbon reduction emission certificates until the market crashed. Indian government believes that this would be an immensely popular and useful method for investing into renewable energy in India. At the same time, India is also going to ask for a loss and damage fund. And on this particular demand, we have 24 other like-minded developing countries who are on our side to push for this demand to the developed world. These countries are going to ask the developed world to set up a fund which will give money to developing nations, especially island nations who face climate extremes from the historic pollutions of the developed world.
Most of the discussions ahead of the summit have revolved around getting all countries to commit to a net zero target by a specific year. However, India has reportedly rejected calls to announce a net zero carbon emissions target. Keep in mind that India's per capita carbon emissions per year is 1.96 tons, while it is 8.4 tons for China, 18.6 tons for the US, and 7.16 tons for the European Union, against a world average of 6.64 tons. Also, a recent report by the Natural Resources Defense Council said that India was largely on track to meet and even exceed its Paris Agreement targets. Even so, India will face considerable pressure from various quarters at the summit, which brings us to our next question. What are the challenges that India will face at COP26?
Pressure that will emanate from the Western countries for India to declare a net zero date. That is the year beyond which India's emissions would equal how much it absorbs. So that's going to really play a major role in the conversations that India will face. Now, India itself would not be too keen on really committing to a date for the simple reason that India is frankly ahead of most other countries as of now. And also India on a per capita basis emits far less carbon than most other countries, developed or developing. So this pressure is going to really play a very important role in India's conversation. So that's one. The second thing that's going to happen is India's commitments to reduce the use of coal or even enhance investments in renewable and clean energies as well as on clean mobility. There, India has played a very, I must say, a leading role. But that pressure is still going to continue.
While it remains to be seen whether India will succeed in its objectives or not, the one clear thing is that its actions will have a considerable impact on the success of the summit. In the end, hopefully, all the countries concerned will remember what's truly important, that COP26 would probably be the last opportunity to contain global warming within agreed upon limits.
The government has extended the tenure of RBI Governor Shaktikanta Das for another 3 years, signalling an endorsement of the policies pursued by him. The central bank under Das flooded the system with liquidity while keeping interest rates low to shore up growth during the pandemic. This report examines what his extension means for the markets.
Economists and markets have welcomed the reappointment of former IAS officer Shaktikanta Das as the Reserve Bank of India's governor. He is the first RBI chief to get an extension since the BJP-led government came to power in 2014. His predecessor Urjit Patel resigned before the end of his term amid differences with the government, and before him, incumbent Raghuram Rajan was not given an extension. If he completes his full 6 years in office, Das will become the longest-serving RBI governor in more than 6 decades. What's more, in what is seen as a vote of confidence in him, the government broke away from the norm of extending the governor's term by 2 years and went ahead with the maximum 3 years permitted. And his extension was announced nearly 2 months before his current term would end. Das has been praised for maintaining a stable relationship with the government, and his extension ensures the continuity of monetary policy. Under Das, the central bank has cut the repo rate from 6.25% in February 2019 to 4% in October 2021 and embarked on liquidity infusion plan. In its October monetary policy, the RBI stopped further liquidity infusion and announced variable rate reverse repo auctions to suck out excess liquidity. As the RBI starts to wind back its loose monetary policy, stability in its top leadership is seen as critical. When Das took over in 2018, India's foreign exchange reserves were $455 billion. With aggressive accumulation, he took it to $641 billion. He oversaw the bailout of Yes Bank and the merger of Lakshmi Vilas Bank with DBS. He also played a key role in ensuring that the government's borrowing program during the pandemic went smoothly without much disruption to the markets. We spoke to CARE Ratings' chief economist Madan Sabnavis on the implication of Das's reappointment.
The extension given to the RBI governor, Mr. Shaktikanta Das, for another 3 years, in my opinion, is a very good idea. In fact, announcing it well before his first term came to an end assuages the market to a large extent so that there is no guesswork as to who is going to be the RBI governor. Now, if you look at Mr. Das's term as governor of RBI, it has been quite exemplary for a couple of reasons. I think the first is that he has worked in a very collaborative mood with the government, which is very important because the RBI and the Ministry of Finance are two arms of the same organization. And unlike the past, where the market always perceived that there was a strong difference of opinion between the RBI and the government of India, this kind of thing has been dispelled, and this collaborative approach has also made sure that the markets didn't have to conjecture as to what is going on in background. The other thing has been in terms of the pandemic, where I think a very critical role was played by the RBI. This was once in a lifetime kind of a situation, and the way the RBI has reacted to ensure that there was adequate liquidity, I think that was something which was very important. And this also ensured that the government, which had a very large borrowing program, didn't really face any hurdles in terms of raising the resources that was required. And the other thing which was always a concern for everyone was what will happen to the NPAs, what will be the state of the banking system. So I think the combination of the moratorium and the restructuring exercises which were brought in by the RBI has to a very large extent proved that the banking sector is once again fairly firm, and we did not have any episodes of NPAs ballooning or any such thing. Now, going forward, I think it's a very critical role for the RBI because growth is going to take place at a much faster pace. There are a lot of challenges which are, of course, there for the entire financial system. And having continuity in the RBI governor's position as well as his stance, I think it's very good for the market because at some stage we know that things have to be unwound. And once this winding up situation does take place, it will have to be done in a calibrated manner. And this is something which the governor has been reiterating constantly in his policies. So again, out here, I think having Mr. Das as governor for the next 3 years, when India would actually be in this stage of faster growth, I think there will be a very harmonious way in which it will be enabled from the monetary side.
What does Samvat 2078 have in store for Indian equity markets? Which sectors look investment worthy? Leading market experts answer these questions and help you better understand what lies ahead.
After a stellar liquidity-driven run in Samvat 2077, experts are suggesting that investors should brace for a volatile phase for Indian equity markets in Samvat 2078. The market direction, they say, will be guided by a host of domestic and foreign factors that will keep the markets choppy. These include commodity prices and their impact on inflation and corporate earnings, policy stance of global central banks, especially the US Federal Reserve, a fresh wave of COVID infections, if any, global developments like economic recovery and China factors, IPO pipeline, and liquidity with retail investors. While rising input prices, especially those of crude oil and coal, have seen the markets trim gains in the past few weeks, analysts at Nomura have penciled in 0.6 to 0.7% rise in inflation over the next few months as a result of this. Sonal Verma, Nomura's chief economist for India and Asia, excluding Japan, said, "We estimate the impact on headline inflation to be as much as around 1 percentage point over the course of the next 6 months." As an investment strategy for Samvat 2078, instead of chasing index-wide returns, experts suggest investors look for companies with sound fundamentals, low debt levels, and revenue and profit visibility, given the multiple headwinds. Rupen Rajguru, head of equity investments and strategy, Julius Baer, for instance, expects the frontline indices to give a high single-digit to a mid-double-digit return in the next year.
Indian markets have witnessed a Teflon rally for the last 18 months. So while we are constructive on the equity markets, but we expect there will be some road bumps ahead in next 1 year. So from an index perspective, we expect a high single digit to a mid double digit returns over next 1 year, while the underperforming sector catching up that theme will continue. As far as sectors are concerned, we like the economy facing sectors, so especially the banking and financial services. We are also positive on the recovery of capex, and hence we like sectors like industrials, capital goods, manufacturing, cement. Finally, we are also constructive on the export theme, so we like healthcare and large cap IT names. We also like specialty chemicals as a sector, but would wait for better entry points. Thank you.
Dhananjay Sinha, Managing Director and Chief Strategist at JM Financial, sees the Nifty between 16,500 and 18,500 levels going ahead. According to Krishna Kumar Karwa, Managing Director of MK Global, ample domestic liquidity will keep market sentiment buoyant despite headwinds. Global liquidity, however, could be at risk as the US Fed starts to taper.
There is abundant liquidity in the domestic ecosystem, as can be seen in the record inflow in the domestic MFs, the rising number of demat accounts being opened on a daily basis, as also the increasing market share of retail volumes on the bourses. Global liquidity could be at a risk as the US Fed starts to taper. In view of the prevailing low interest rate environment, we will continue to see domestic investors invest in equities. As far as investing in primary or secondary markets are concerned, money will flow wherever there are opportunities. Tech-led IPOs will continue to drive investor interest wherever there are no local listed comparables.
So while gains at index level may not be significant in the upcoming Samvat, investors should brace for a volatile phase in equities now, with good financial and operational performance by corporates getting suitably rewarded at the bourses despite headwinds. Talking of the market drivers for this holiday curtailed week, all eyes will be on manufacturing and services PMI data for India and the monthly auto sales figures, the outcome of US Federal Reserve meeting for cues on when the central bank plans to hike rates. On Thursday, the exchanges will hold a special Muhurat trading session in the evening to usher in Samvat 2078. Bharti Airtel, SBI, HDFC, IRCTC, Tata Motors and HPCL are some of the prominent companies that are scheduled to announce their September quarter results this week.
From looking things up on search engines to ordering food, reading news, and booking cabs, we use web services every day. But do you know the web as we know it is just a fraction of the actual web space? Yes, and that is why it is called the surface web. It is available for access to anyone and everyone with access to the internet. But there is a whole lot more to the web which is not accessible to everyone. People call it the dark web. Curious to know what the dark web is, who uses it, and why it is a malign space? Let's take a look.
The dark web is a reality that has existed since the beginning of the internet. While there's a load of information indexed on the web and easily accessible by anyone with internet connectivity, irrespective of geography, there's even more information and data that does not come to your notice because it is hidden and requires special privileges to access. This uncharted part of web is called the dark web. Information on the dark web is not defined by regulations and content policies. Moreover, web pages serving information on the dark web do not appear on search engine result pages or SERPs, like those of Google and Bing, because they're hidden and not indexed. Therefore, the dark web includes information that is not easily accessible by everyone. Besides, the web pages serving up information on the dark web are marked unsafe by browsers and do not open on regular internet browsers like Chrome, Firefox, Opera, and Safari. Dark web is also home to all sorts of information, but it has gained a bad name because of the prevalence of widespread illegal content such as illicit pornography, sale of black market drugs, sale of illegal firearms, illegally acquired user databases, etc. The availability of such illegal content makes the dark web a playground for nefarious activities. Among positive use cases, investigative journalists are able to gather information from sources using dark web without risking their identity. Whistleblowers use it to expose corruption at corporations and in governments. While accessing the dark web itself is not illegal, using the dark web for acquiring illegal content or procuring prohibited items is illegal. For example, surfing the dark web is not illegal, but if you procure pirated copies of movies and games, it would be illegal. Similarly, accessing information would not be illegal unless the information is classified and can be a potential security risk to a nation. Using the dark web to access illicit content like child pornography or to procure prohibited items like drugs and guns would also be illegal. To access dark web safely, one needs a specialized software with built-in peer-to-peer networking support, besides other browser features. Currently, softwares like Tor and I2P support these. There are web browsers with added tools to encrypt web traffic for safety and security. It is possible to access the dark web anonymously through such software. Additionally, virtual private networks add another layer of security here. However, it must be noted that these softwares do not offer foolproof protection. As a best practice, one should not reveal their real identity on the dark web. Also, one should not use any banking or other financial services through such software.
That's all we have for you today. We will be back tomorrow with more news and analysis in our next episode. Stay tuned. Thank you for watching.
If you like this video, share it and subscribe to Business Standard. For more news, views and insights, log on to www.business-standard.com. Do also follow us on YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, Telegram and LinkedIn.